Good morning. I'm just getting my coffee going because today we are planning to get everything prepped that we can for the next set of meals for this challenge. We have 12 meals and we're using a lot of ingredients that will overlap, so let's get started. So our goals today are to get 3 onions diced, sliced carrots, diced carrots, and matchstick carrots, slice 5 stalks of celery, brown and divide the ground beef, bake the French bread, roast the chicken and pull the meat, and to make the chicken broth. Getting this all together ahead of time is going to give us more time when we need to cook later. So first thing we're going to do here is get our onions ready. I'm just peeling off the papers from the outside of the onions, and those I usually put in the garbage. But that layer of onion that's right underneath that paper that's a little bit kind of squishy, it's not firm, I like to save those, and that is part of what we're going to use. These scraps are going to help us flavor our chicken broth or stock, however you want to look at it. So I'm just putting those pieces in this bowl here to save for that. Now when I cut my onions, I cut off the top end and I leave the root end on, and then I slice in half through the root. So I'm going to go ahead and get all 3 of these peeled, put my spare pieces in the bowl, and cut off that top end. And then I have a method for dicing up onions that I like, that I think works the best. So what you do is you lay it down flat like this, and then you're going to be cutting sideways into the onion this direction. And you're going to cut 2 or 3 times to make a few layers. Place your hand on flat so that you do not cut yourself, and press down to put tension, and then slice into the onion a couple of times. And here you can see what that would look like. Then you will cut the other direction all the way down to the root, but not through the end, so that it all sort of stays together. Then when you turn it sideways and cut through it, it creates these nice little diced pieces. So I think I learned that on a cooking show somewhere, and it's worked really well for me and helps me get through these really quick. So that's the method I used, and we diced up all 3 onions. The onions were so potent, I was crying by the time we were done here. And check out all the scraps I got saved. Now I'm going to slice up my 5 stalks of celery. This should help me through all the recipes I need. I'm going to cut off the leaves on the top, but again, I'm not going to get rid of those. I'm going to put them in my scrap bowl because I'm going to use that to flavor my stock. And the same with the ends there. Just cutting those off, putting them in my bowl. And then just going ahead and slicing them all together. These will be really good in the soup and in our pot pie recipe. So you're cutting them or slicing them into small sizes for those. Now we have a bunch of carrots we need to get prepped. So the first thing I'm going to do is peel all of them. And this is my favorite peeler. It's one that has a peeler on one side, and then on the other side it has a matchstick maker. And that's what I'll be using for that piece as well. It makes it super, super easy. So I'm just going to go ahead and peel them all using just the basic peeler side. And again, I'm going to save all the scraps. So I'm going to save these peelings. And then when I cut off the top and the ends, I'm going to save those too. So I'm just going to go through and peel all of these carrots. All right, now that they're all peeled, I'm going to go ahead and just, again, cut off the top portion and cut off the very tip, keeping those scraps as well, throwing them in my bucket here. And then we're going to be ready to get these cut up into the right shapes we need for each of our recipes. Separating these out from our 2 pounds, I'm going to use 1 to make for my broccoli cheese soup, 2 are going to be for a side dish, 3 for the chicken noodle soup, 3 smaller ones for the shepherd's pie, and 2 more for the chicken pot pie. So first what I'm going to do here is, again, that matchstick that I need for the broccoli cheese soup. And I've just flipped over my peeler, and on the other side, it peels up these nice long matchsticks. So I'm just going to get as much of this carrot as I possibly can and pull it into matchsticks. Next, I need to slice up several of these carrots for chicken pot pie and for chicken noodle soup. So here I'm just slicing those for these recipes. I've also got another bunch that I'll pull out that I need to slice as well for the side dish of carrots that I'm going to use. So I've picked kind of the medium-sized ones for this and the larger size for those that I'm going to use for a side dish. I'm going to go ahead and get those all sliced up, and we'll toss those into its own little Tupperware separate from those matchstick carrots, ready to use for our recipes. The last thing I need to do is get some of these smaller carrots and the remnants from my matchstick carrots and get them cut up into a dice. This is going to be for the shepherd's pie because we want that to be in a dice, not into a slice or a matchstick. So really I'm just sort of cutting these into pieces for this little one, and then for the bigger ones I'll cut them in half again, and then go ahead and cut them sideways to make diced carrots. Now that we are done with our carrots, we need to get this hamburger, or ground beef I should call it, browned up. And we're using this in several recipes, and so if they're all needing to be browned, we might as well do it all at once here, and then we can separate it out into the 3 sections we need. One for the pizza burgers or sloppy joes, whichever you're choosing to make, one for the shepherd's pie, and a smaller portion for the goulash. So we'll go ahead and just put this on the stove over about a medium-high heat and get it browned up. And then we want to drain off the excess fat and let it cool. All right, we're on a roll. Next up is our garlic. Now, yes, you could definitely buy the pre-minced garlic in the jars, but watch when I do this. You'll be so surprised. I just bought this at Aldi. It's 3 cloves. The bottom there you see is the root end. I'm going to put that down and press on the top. That's going to help separate the cloves on the inside of this garlic bulb so that they'll be easy to peel. And I'm just going to, again, peel the papers off the outside. Those will go in the garbage. And then you'll see when I get to these cloves, some of them on the outside are nice and big, and others are kind of small. So for those that are really small and just, gosh, not even worth the effort of peeling, I throw those in that scrap bucket, and I'll let that use for flavoring my stock. So we'll get these all peeled apart into individual cloves, and then I'll show you a neat trick for getting the papers off the individual cloves. So here I'm getting out just this little mini food processor. I got this from my grandma. I'm pretty sure she had it in the original box for about 30 years and never used it, but I am sure getting my use out of it, especially for my garlic. So what I'm doing here is I'm picking out the smaller cloves, as I mentioned. Those I'm just going to toss into my scrap bucket and let that flavor my broth. So picking out the ones that are just really not worth fussing over too much. Putting those in my scrap bucket. Next, I want to get the papers off the individual cloves. So what you want to do is lay it down, put your knife on top, and press it. And you can lean on it pretty hard. What that does is it's going to release some oils in the garlic, and that is going to allow the papers to slide off a lot easier. So when you want to peel a lot of garlic, you just give it a little press or a little whack. Be careful because, of course, knives are sharp. I do this a lot, so it's second nature to me, but please take care if this is how you're doing it and it's your first time. So I'll get these all peeled up and into that little food processor and get them blended up. All right, so they're all peeled and in my little blender. You're going to add maybe just about an eighth a cup of water, just a couple tablespoons even, to give it a little bit of movement when you hit the button. And I'm just going to let it mince up here just for a few seconds. And that's really all there is to it. Now we've got minced garlic. And check this out. So I'm going to take that minced garlic and I'm going to put it back in the jar that I was just dumping the water out of. And I'm going to put it next to the jar that I bought at the store, just to give you an idea of how much garlic this actually made. When you put it in the jar, you do want to add just a little bit of lemon juice. There's citric acid in there then that can help preserve this. But this garlic will be good for me for probably a couple of weeks, and it costs me half as much as buying one from the store. If you didn't know this already, the ones at the store are typically made with more of like an elephant garlic, which isn't even truly a garlic, but is part of the leek family, and so therefore isn't as potent. It's much more mild. So as well as it being half the cost, and you'll see the same size as what I bought in the store, it's actually more potent. So I'm really getting a lot more bang for my buck, and it's costing me half as much. So check it out. Here's mine versus the store. Crazy, right? All right, next piece then is to get these chickens roasting. So I've got these two free-range 3.75-pound fresh chickens here. I'm just pulling them out of their outer wrapper, and really important that you check your chicken because this one has inside what's called the giblets, things like the neck and the organ meat and so forth. So reach inside and check, and you'll pull out one of these little packets. I don't want that in my roasting pan. So just pulling it out, making sure that nothing else is in there, dumping out any excess from the inside on the liquids. And I'll get the second one going here. Have you seen my video about not wasting things? These are just two of those lemons that I had squeezed the juice out of to make lemon bars, and I saved the rinds for exactly a reason like this. I just had a bunch of chicken juice go down my drain, and now I'm putting those lemons in there, letting my grinder grind it up, and it smells so much better, and that citric acid helps clean it out too. Now I've got the chickens on just this baking sheet here. We want to make sure that we're getting these very dry. So I'm just getting some paper towels here, getting underneath the legs, in between the wings and the breasts, trying to get them as dry as possible. What this is going to do is help to get the skin nice and crispy, which means that we can then easily get it off the chicken. We won't really be needing the skin for the recipes we're using since we are just going to be pulling the meat off the bones, and we don't need that extra fat or crispiness on our chicken. You can also see here just to my right that I've got my roasting pan out. That's what I'll be cooking mine in, but you can definitely roast them in the oven too in just a regular roasting pan. So now that these are all dry, we're ready to get them in the roasting pan, seasoned up and with our scraps so that we can get the meat cooked and ready to pull off the bone. You'll want to put your chickens in the roasting pan breast side up. That's going to help keep those nice chickens are in the roaster. Juicy. I'm just going to give them a nice liberal drizzle with the olive oil. That's going to also help the overall flavor and keep the skin, again, crispy. Then we're going to add about a cup or two of water. I think I just added about a cup this time. We really just want to make sure that we're not scorching anything. So if you're using a roasting pan, put a little bit of water in the bottom. Then take all these beautiful scraps. Just a reminder, we've got carrot, onion, celery leaves, and some of those garlic cloves that were just too small to even bother peeling. And we're just going to sprinkle those around the outside. And this is going to give flavor to the chicken, but also it's going to give great flavor to the stock. that we're going to make after the chicken is cooked. Last thing we need to do before we put it in the roaster and let it go is season it up. So I'm just really using some salt and pepper, but if you had some thyme leaves, oh my gosh, that would be great with this. Or even just a little rosemary, whatever you really have herbs-wise really gives great flavor to chicken. Today we're keeping it simple, just using our scraps and a little salt and pepper. I'm going to roast at 350 degrees for 20 to 25 minutes per pound, so just over an hour for this bird. Next up is our French bread recipe. So the first step is going to be to combine our yeast and some warm water. You want the water to be about 105 to 110 degrees. If it's cooler, it might not activate the active dry yeast, and if it is too warm, you'll kill the yeast. So check the temperature if you can. Mix your yeast in with the water and put a little bit of sugar in there as well. That's going to get the yeast to really start consuming those sugars and foaming up. That's how you'll know that your yeast is good and will help you get a good rise. So just putting it together, and now I'm transferring it into the larger bowl so that I can mix it together. So now you can see that it's all foamed up. It looks a little bit like the foam on the top of a latte if you're a coffee drinker. That's a good sign. That means that our yeast is activated. For the next step, we want to start by adding just some of the flour in first. It's really important when you're working with bread, especially if you're new, to always start slow with the flour and add a little bit at a time. So most bread recipes like this are going to tell you to put in just maybe 1/4 of the amount of flour you need, and then add it a half a cup or a 1/4 cup at a time until you reach what you need for the feel of the dough. And the more that you do this, the more you'll have a better idea what it should feel like. So here I'm just adding a little bit of that flour and then also adding the salt that we want to flavor the bread. If you don't put any salt in, it's going to taste like nothing. So don't forget this step. I've been there before. It's no good. Go ahead and just give it a nice mix, get it well incorporated, and then we'll move to the next step where we'll be adding more flour. And then I realized I forgot one little step. I needed to add a little bit of butter to this mixture. So just adding that tablespoon of butter in. This again is still kind of warm, so the butter pretty much starts to melt as you put it in there. It's not hot, remember, so it's not going to melt quickly, but just pressing it with your spoon and stirring it around. Once you get to the kneading process, you're not going to have to worry about that being chunky anymore. It's going to be all mixed in. Now we're going to be adding a lot more flour, so we're going to take it out of the little bowl and move it into our big bowl. And we're going to begin adding flour, again, just a little bit at a time, and then we'll see how it feels along the way, and I'll show you when I stop. We're starting to get close here, so I'm going to actually put down my spoon, and this is where I'm going to start using my hands. What we're looking for the dough to do is it still should be moist and sticky. Try to keep one hand clean, because when you start getting dough on your hand, it will stick to the ball and be a very sticky process. Good way of testing to see if your dough is dry or sticky is to use a clean hand and touch it and see, does it still stick or does it pull away? We want the dough to pull away from the side of the bowl, which it is doing, but as you can see with my hand, it's still pretty sticky, and here you can see the more I mix, the more it seems to be sticking. So I'm just sort of pulling it and moving it around with my hand, and it looks like we're going to need a little bit more flour. So I'm just going to put in just a little bit at a time, a tablespoon or two at a time, because it will go from moist to dry pretty quick. And if you put too much flour in your bread dough, you will end up with a dense, flat, not fluffy loaf of bread, and nobody wants that. So again, just keep adding a little bit at a time and give it a feel. I'm going to clean off my fingers here, and I'm actually going to go wash my hands. I want to get all of the dough off. Again, the more dough you have on your hands, when you touch the dough, it's going to stick. So I'm going to wash and come back and give it another feel. At this stage, I'm going to pull out my silicone mat here and just put a little flour in the middle. I've got my cup of flour off to the side here because inevitably I may want a little bit more or even just some to dust my hands. So before I get all sticky, good to make sure that I've got that little cup there or a little pile of flour for me to pull from. I'm turning my dough out onto the lightly floured surface here. And again, I'm going to try to keep one of my hands a little bit cleaner if possible, just so that I have a good feel for whether it's dry or sticky based on a dry hand. So to knead, I'm just going to be pressing and turning, pressing and turning. You can see as I'm showing my hand here that some of it is sticking, but not too bad, not too bad. The more you work the dough, the more the flour is going to absorb the liquid and become moist. And so that's why the more you knead, the more sticky it gets when it is a little bit too sticky. This is too sticky. We don't want it this sticky or it's not going to work very well. But what I have learned in my bread making, I'm a little bit of a novice at it still, but what I've learned is that stickier is better if you want fluffier bread. You just don't want it so sticky that you can't knead it. The kneading process is important for bread because what it does is it creates that gluten structure. And the gluten structure is what allows those little air pockets to form and fluff up the bread. So you've sort of got to find that sweet spot. I'm using my dry hand now to feel it out because I know that my wet hand there is going to stick. So just sort of pushing and pulling it around and kneading it. And I'll continue to add just little bits of flour as I knead it as I go here. Okay, so I'm pretty sure we're in a good spot now. I went and washed my hands because I want to feel this again with clean and dry hands. I'm just going to a smidge more flour, maybe about a tablespoon here, because I think that's all I'm going to want to do. I'm touching it with my hand and pulling my hand away, and yes, some of it is sticking, but it is not sticking like it was in the beginning where I could pull my hand up and the whole thing came with it. So I think we're in a pretty good spot, maybe just a smidge more, just to give it a little bit easier workability, and we are going to be set. We are almost done with this project, so I've got that smidge more of flour here. I'm going to use that to help me shape the dough. So this recipe, instead of having it rise, a lot of bread recipes will have you knead the dough, then let it rise, then punch it down, then shape it, and then let it rise again. This recipe is super simple because you don't do that first leavening stage. You just knead it until it's ready to go, and you've got the gluten structure. About 5 minutes you want to be kneading it, and then we're going to shape it into the French loaf. So I'm going to do one larger loaf. You could do two smaller loaves, but I prefer just the one larger one because I'm going to be using it for bread and butter, and I'm going to be using it for French toast. You will know that you've had enough kneading when you poke your dough. You'll see me poking it here every couple of minutes. When you poke the dough, you should see it react. The dough should start to slowly spring back. If you poke it and it stays as a whole, you don't have it kneaded enough. If you poke it and it springs back immediately, you've overdone it. So check it frequently as you get to that 3 to 5 minutes, and then knead until you get to the place where you poke it and it starts to come back slowly. Here I'm shaping that into the one long roll basically for the French bread. So I'm just really rolling it like you'd roll a rolling pin. It sort of feels like you're playing with Play-Doh at this point, but just roll it out into a long log, and then we'll be putting it on a parchment paper covered baking sheet. And you can do a few slits across the top if you want to be fancy. I did it just because I like to be fancy, I guess, but you don't have to. The slits just sort of make it look nice. Then we need to let it rise. So we're going to cover it. I just use like a flour sack dish towel. Cover it, place it on top of the preheating oven. That's a good place where it's nice and warm, and let it rise for about 30 minutes. Here my hamburger or ground beef has cooled enough. I'm going to go ahead and separate it out into the dishes. So I need about 2/3 of a pound for our goulash. So there's that little one. And then the rest of it, I'm going to split between two, about 2 pounds a piece then for each of these two. This will be for the sloppy joes or pizza burgers, and then for the shepherd's pie. So we'll get those separated out, and we can throw those right in the freezer unless you're planning to make one of these recipes in the next 2 days. All right, we're hitting the home stretch here. We do need to get some of our green beans prepped up. I am going to use a lot of them for a side dish, but I'm also going to use some in the shepherd's pie. So just to prepare them, all you need to do is cut off, the blossom end and cut off the stem end. Just clean them up a little bit. And then for the shepherd's pie, we want to cut them into these bite-sized pieces. So I'm cutting up maybe about cup and a half and throwing them in a little dish, and those will be ready to go for that recipe. So here are our chickens. I've got my little probe in there. We're looking for 165 or higher. I've got 167, so that's great. That means the chickens are done. So we can shut off the roaster, pull the chickens out, and put them on a cookie sheet, let them cool. They'll need to be cool so we can pick the meat off of them. It's now been enough time for our bread to rise, so I'm just taking 1 egg white and I'm whipping it up here with this little whisk. This tiny little whisk just gives me a good smile. It's actually my daughter's whisk. It's got a little heart on the inside, so I like to use it for these tiny tasks. Here, this red thing I'm showing you is actually an egg yolk separator. If you see my kitchen tools video, this is something that someone gave me where you can separate the egg yolks with that if you like. I just use the shell, but nice little tip for someone who's newer at that process. So just get the egg whites nice and foamy, and then we're going to use that to brush on top of our loaf. That's what's going to give it a little bit of color versus if you bake it just as is, it would be pretty pale and white. I should mention you do not need to use all of the egg white. You're going to have a lot left over. The goal is really just to coat well the top of the bread. So if you can think of something to use that extra egg white for, please do so. Try not to waste things around here. I didn't really have anything in mind, so we just used what we could, and the rest of it went down the drain, unfortunately. But here now our loaf is going to be ready to hit the oven and come out nice and golden brown. The chicken is cooled down enough for me to be able to pull it out. You can see it's still steaming, but being able to at least pull it out and put it on this cookie sheet so it can cool off a bit faster. So I'm going to pull these out and we'll get them cooling down a little bit more. And then the next step will be to pull the meat off. Here's what's left over in the roasting pan. I am just going to add about 4 quarts of filtered water to what's already in here. And this is the chicken drippings, all those things that we had from our scraps. You'll see a little half of a lemon, or a lemon cut in half, I should say, in here. I just happen to have that, so I tossed it in, but definitely you don't need to have that, and that's not one of the ingredients I put on the list for today. But you're just going to put that in there, and you're going to cook this on a very low heat, like 150 or 200 degrees for several hours. I'm going to put this in here now, and I'm going to leave it there overnight. In the morning, I will shut it off and let it cool down naturally, and then that's where we're going to get our chicken broth from. So we're looking at about 12 to 18 hours. Our bread is out of the oven, and it looks beautiful, nice and brown, ready to cut up. Don't cut it up yet though. You want it to be very cool when you cut so that you don't tear the bread. And you'll know it's done if you tap on the top and it sounds kind of like a hollow sound. That's how you'll know the bread is done. Our chickens have cooled down significantly more. We're now going to be able to get the meat off of them. And what I plan to do is use the legs and thighs, which are down at the bottom, of course, here. You just pull them out to the side and break that joint. This is all dark meat here. I'm going to use that dark meat for the chicken pot pie, and I'm going to use that dark meat for my chicken and gravy over mashed potatoes recipe. So the legs and the thighs are where you're going to get a majority of that dark meat from. So I'm going to go ahead and just pick the meat off and take the bones and throw them in with the broth because that'll give a lot of good flavor, and a lot of those little chicken pieces will give flavor as well. You'll notice now that I'm pulling the wings off, I do try to get a little bit of meat off of them if I can, but truthfully, it's almost pointless on a small bird like this. Again, these are 3.5 or 3.75 pounds. I'll pick off the little bits of meat I can, and then the rest of it, I don't agonize over it. I'll just throw it in to the broth mix as well. Again, there's chicken pieces and there's bones in there that'll do lots of good flavoring, so don't worry about those too much. Now for the chicken breast, you're going to have the top portion and the bottom portion. What I would recommend doing is starting at the vent, which is where the tail would be, and just sort of pulling apart the sides. And because these are cooked, they're going to break. These bones are going to break very easily. I know that sounds kind of gross, but these fresh whole chickens are absolutely the way to go when it comes to flavor versus just prepackaged breasts or thighs. But anyhow, pull off all the skin here, and you'll see on the inside, also on the other end, you've got the neck, and you can just stick your thumb in there. Look how easy that came off. That's the back end of the rib cage and the spine, and then we've got that tail portion picked off. There is a hardened piece in the inside here where it's bone, so you can see that. What I would recommend doing to separate these then is just flip it back over, and in between the two breasts, just wiggle your thumbs in between the two. They will separate, and then you can just peel them off of that hardened bone section. And that's what's going to give you these two beautiful big chicken breasts. Make sure you get all of that hardened bone off of there. This is actually a breast and the tender. If you ever wondered where the chicken tenders came from, the tenderloins. So we're getting the chicken breasts, and I'm putting those in a separate bowl. The chicken breasts will be used for the chicken divan and for the chicken noodle soup because those feature uncovered pieces of chicken versus the others that have it as part of a mix. So I find that that white meat chicken does better for those circumstances. So we've got one bird broken down. We've got all these lovely bones over here and skin. Let's break down the other one, and then we'll get ready to toss those bones and skin in with that chicken broth. Okay, so now we have all of this good stuff in here. You can pick out the big pieces of skin. We want to try to take those out because that will create fat. You can take out the vent, that's that back tail piece. We don't want that in there for our broth. Just get the big pieces out. There's that other vent. And now we're going to take all these bones and the juices and we're going to slide them right into the cooker. Put the lid on. Set this to about 200 degrees and let that sit for several hours. All right, so here's what we came out with. We have a little bit of dark meat here from our thighs and legs and wings. And here we have the white meat for big chicken breasts from those chickens. We'll be using the breasts mostly for the chicken noodle soup and the chicken divan. And then we'll be using the dark meat and whatever's left of the white meat we don't use for the chicken and gravy over mashed potatoes and for the chicken pot pie. Okay, so the chicken broth has been doing its thing for several hours. I let it go overnight and in the morning turned it off so that it would cool down. And now that it's cooled down, we're ready to strain all of the bones and the vegetables out. And we're just going to use a strainer like this, a very fine one. And I just use a bucket or whatever I've got that I can strain into. You're just gonna lift out the inside piece, or if you're using a pot, of course, you could just do it that way. Pull out the pot and then pour it right over the tea to catch all the chunks. It's getting kind of full, so I'm going to stop for a minute. And there's our chicken broth. So we're just going to jar these up in quart-sized jars. And then I'll be canning some of these in my pressure canner so that they can be shelf stable. But if you're using them right away in the recipes this week, you can just go right ahead and put them in your refrigerator. And you want to fill them pretty full. This is full to about 1 inch of headspace here, just the bar or the band at the top. And then all of this is now going to go in the scrap. Don't put this in your compost because it does contain those animal bones. Here we are in my big Presto pressure cooker, and I want to get these cans shelf stable. So I'm going to put them in. This is cool water. I didn't want it hot because the broth isn't hot that I put in it. You always want to start at the same temperatures. So I've got 3 jars in here that I'm going to pressure can. I'm going to use the 4th for my recipe tonight. So I'm just going to stick these in here. I'm going to lock on the lid. And then we are going to take this little piece off and let it firmly vent for 10 minutes. After those 10 minutes of open venting have passed, put that little weight back on and let it pressure at 10 psi for about 25 minutes. Then you can turn off the heat. Alright, so it's much later now, but just wrapping up this video, that probably all took me about 2 hours. I multitask through the whole process, so while I'm waiting for something to cook, I might be cutting something else, or while a pot of water is coming up to a boil, I'm slicing and dicing something else. So if you multitask, I bet you could complete all these tasks in about 2 hours, and that maybe sounds like a lot, but think down the road. When you go to put together your shepherd's pie, your vegetables are all cut, your beef is all browned, so a lot of those individual steps at the beginning are going to be cut out and make that night a lot faster. And again, because a lot of these recipes share these different ingredients, we were able to prep them all at the same time and save ourselves some of that time as well. Look for the next several videos. I'm going to link in a playlist with each of the recipes that we make so that you can watch me do it, and then also check for the links of the recipes in each of those as well. Thanks for coming along with me on this adventure. This is part 2 of 3. See you in the next part.